Hello and welcome to episode 107 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. So today, I've got a question for you. Why do you choose to develop on Linux? What is it about Linux that draws you to it as a development platform?
For me, it's just incredibly comfortable. I was thinking about this today, and there's just some habits I'm in that I think it'd be really hard to get out of.
I think for me, it's the flexibility. Just about everything that I'm working on, if I need to dig down at a lower level or see something, it's there. There's a tool for it. There's some way that I can look at it. There's some way that I can introspect the hardware. It's flexible. It's easy to use. Easy, I guess, is relative terms, but it's easier than it is on some other proprietary OSs.
For me, it's just what I know. I didn't use Windows until after I had a pretty okay grasp of Linux. And from what everyone's told me, developing on Windows is really painful, so I just stick with Linux. And when I have attempted to replicate my workflow on Windows, I've given up.
I've wondered too, like if it's a workflow thing, like I have a workflow that I use on Linux, and that's the one that I'm comfortable with. That's the one that I'm happy with. And the few times that I've gone to a Windows-based machine to replicate that workflow, I've always wondered if it's my workflow that's just not the Windows way. Mm-hmm. And maybe if I would acquiesce for the Windows way, it would be, less painful. But at the same time, I'm super happy and super productive with the Linux workflow that I've developed over the years.
When I am on Windows, I typically just use VS Code or Thea, because they tend to bundle a bunch of the tools, so you don't have to seek out the websites and download the EXEs and whatnot.
I wonder, too, if it matters like what level of the stack that you're working in or, what technology it is you're building against. Obviously, if you're building a Windows-based application, probably developing on Windows is best. But I wonder if the three of us here just end up working on things that are kind of naturally more aligned to a Linux desktop, or if we've picked those things to work on because of the Linux desktop. I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg.
There are two aspects of it to me. There's the comfort and there's the tooling. So in terms of comfort, I just find that when I'm on a Linux desktop that I'm familiar with, like the screen updates really quickly. I'm not sitting waiting for things. I know exactly what keyboard shortcuts get me to where. I have just a terminal that just feels clean and snappy and everything works. So that's the kind of the feeling part. And then the tooling, I think the tooling is the kind of stuff you're talking about, Kevin, like for a lot of bits of the stack, including the web stack and lots of C, C++, Rust, other stuff, all the tools are just available and ready and just work really naturally in Linux, and everything feels like an extra effort in Windows. I haven't done much on the Mac. When I've used a Mac, I just felt confused and sad and like I didn't have the stuff I needed.
That's interesting because in my mind, a Mac is the kind of best of both worlds. You get all the software that you could possibly want to run, pretty much, apart from some games and whatnot. But you also supposedly have this Unix-like underpinning with a proper terminal.
Yeah, I mean, you do have a proper terminal, but it's in a window that doesn't snap to things, and it just feels all wrong, and things are in the wrong place, and I don't have my virtual desktop.
And you have the worst file manager in the world.
Yeah, I just cannot understand where things are or how you get to things, yeah.
Some things about Finder are nice. Some things are not.
I've never given the Mac a fair chance. Whenever I try it, I just feel like I've got a headache or something, and then I go back to Linux.
So in a previous job, they were a Mac first shop. Not that we developed for Mac. All of the software we developed was run on Linux, but at least for the employees, they would hand you a MacBook Air or something. And the terminal-based workflow is mostly the same. They ship with some old versions, like old versions of Bash, which does create some headaches. So most of that can be worked around. Where Mac was somewhat limiting is definitely in the GUI side, that everything feels wrong about Finder, at least to me. But also just the control that Apple has, it's nice because everything is, once you're aligned to the Mac way, everything is kind of where you'd expect it to be. But the control is just like, they never let go. There's some things you're like, I want to do this, or I want to look at this one particular piece. And Mac's like, no, you can't do that. So it's like a veneer of a Unix-like work environment, which is great. But then as soon as you want to go like one level deeper, all bets are off. And then if you're talking Apple Silicon, then if you want to do things like containers, you're in a world of running a VM just to run a container in the VM, which to me just feels icky.
But if you're willing to pay for parallels, then my understanding is it's a pretty decent experience.
But you're still running a VM. Like Docker is natively Linux. based, and so is Podman, and so are so many of the things that make our lives better.
Whenever you're working in a virtualized environment, I always find there's just like small little things that don't work exactly like on bare metal. Not that it can't be done. I've done a lot of development inside of a VM, but if that's the native way that, at least to build some backend tools in Linux, you have to run them in a VM, to me, it just feels wrong. It feels like swimming upstream or against the grain or whatever metaphor you want to use.
Yeah, you're always going to have some performance penalty, even if it's like 5%. That's the kind of best case scenario. And the worst case scenario is just a horrible, clunky experience in a VM.
Exactly. And a lot of times too, the containers that we would run, at least at that company, when they would spin up into a VM, you might have multiple containers that you want to run or multiple VMs. And just before you know it, you've already taxed the small little like M1A or whatever we were using. Even though it's a great performing machine, you've taxed it to where it can barely run.
Yeah, especially as you're stuck with the RAM that came with it in the first place. And if that's 8 gigabytes, then yeah, good luck running a bunch of VMs.
And that lack of flexibility is not only hardware, it's also software, right? And so, like, I think most people probably benefit from having a few animations that show you what's happening when a window gets minimized. They can see where it's gone or whatever, but I can't stand animations. So I can have a Linux desktop with all the animations turned off. And, when I press a key, that thing happens immediately. And when I get into an environment that's not like that, I just feel like it's wasting my time and making me feel bad.
It feels sluggish to me. If the animation takes longer than, a few milliseconds, I'm like, what am I waiting for?
Are you like me? Have you gone into developer options in Android and turned off animations?
Yeah, I love it. Every time I see that little arrow in a circle that is not moving, I feel good about my life. I also think, I think it's probably fairly obscure, but I really like the fact that I have the option open on Linux to customize further by actually hacking on the stuff. So in the past, I have fixed little bugs that really irritated me in like the task list in GNOME 2 or whatever, to have that option available or for someone else to do that if I don't get round to it, that is a fantastic freedom to have.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also been times where I've been working in like eBPF programs or things that are really low level in the network stack. And to be able to break open the Linux source and view everything about the network stack right there that's a game changer. It's so much easier than trying to read through the Win32 API or whatever it is that the Microsoft equivalent.
And also just the total flexibility to install other tools. I can't get over my addiction to Bash, but I probably should be using Fish. Isn't that supposed to be better? But that's there. The cool kids can use it.
Well, at least on Windows now, there are some cross-platform shells, like New Shell is one that gets you a good way there. PowerShell is, I guess, once you acclimatize to it, it's not terrible. It's just super verbose. But at the same time, I'm more of a ZSH person, but
right.
That is absolutely, that's like holding a warm blanket.
We've kind of touched on this already, but I do wonder to what extent it is the user interface and the customizations you can make there versus the underpinnings, the kind of tooling. What balance of that do you think draws you to Linux for development?
For me, I think it's mostly the underpinnings. I would say when it comes to the GUI part of it, I like a tiling window manager, and that's about it. Beyond that, keyboard shortcuts to get around, but almost all of my work happens inside of a terminal. So it's all of that tooling, but it's also the tooling related, like kind of adjacent to what we're doing. So being able to stand up test environments and control the network packets between various VMs or containers and all of the tooling that Linux provides in that realm, that's just that's the game changer for me.
For me, to be honest, it is 9 virtual desktops laid out in a grid. It is a terminal that I can have tabs on and that runs NeoVim really well. And that can chain things together. I love the fact that underlying that is something that I could hack on in theory, which I never do. It gives me a really warm, fuzzy feeling that it's all open source down to the kernel. But the thing that makes me feel okay day to day is just that my NeoVim experience is really good.
Totally concur with that.
You could do that on Windows or macOS though, couldn't you? You could get loads of virtual desktops. You can get a tabbed terminal. You can get NeoVim to work, can't you?
I think you probably could get all that working, although there would be a longer delay when you switched virtual desktops than what I'm used to. And it probably wouldn't work with my keyboard shortcuts, which I basically can't live without, like switch virtual desktops. And the terminal would look ugly. To me, the terminal on a Mate desktop is just exactly how a terminal should look. And anything else is not right.
Yeah, every time I've used NeoVim on Windows, there's always I don't know. There's just like little things that either don't work or don't work right. And I'm sure they could be solved. I'm sure if I put in enough time to do that, I could figure it out. But it's just stuff that I don't have time for. I have a job that I have to complete. So, and sometimes it's even like font rendering. The fonts on Windows, I don't know, just look a little bit worse. Or maybe it's just the way I have the desktop set up. I couldn't really say because I haven't invested the time to figure that part of it out. But on Linux, I can make it all work. I can copy over some dot files and just get on with my day.
I'm convinced that there is no such thing as fonts looking worse or better. Don't at me. I know someone will.
I'll at you right here. Fonts on Windows look like crap.
Yeah.
Well, I have heard the exact opposite from Windows users coming to Linux. Oh, the fonts aren't right. They look like crap. They're just different, aren't they?
That might be true.
Maybe.
It's just what you get used to, I think.
I have to say, this whole conversation is making me very happy because I remember back in the day when I used to listen to Lug Radio that we were all putting up with Linux when Windows was a much better experience in every way. And we were putting up with all these gripes that made it a bad experience, but we wanted to be on the free one. And now I honestly can tell you it's the other way around, that everything is better for me on Linux. And these non-free operating systems just feel alien and uncomfortable.
I think for me, it is the tooling and the ecosystem and the ease of use and whatnot that keep me inside those open source ecosystems. I don't think it's necessarily Linux specifically that keeps me here. If I can get most of my workflow on BSD, absolutely, I'll switch. I think that would be fun, but I don't think I can replicate all the important bits as easily on a non-free system.
Absolutely. I think I wouldn't notice at all if we swapped out the Linux kernel for the herd or something else. So long as it worked, I wouldn't notice.
Big asterisk there, as long as it worked.
I would miss the games, but that's what my Windows installation is for. It already is my gaming console.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by 1Password. Imagine your company's security like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass that are the actual straightest line from point A to B. Those are unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but a lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today, and it's now generally available to companies with Okta and Microsoft Entra, and in beta for Google Workspace customers. So support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/LinuxDevTime. That's onepassword.com/LinuxDevTime. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxdevtime.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed that includes either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you also get quite a lot of episodes a day or so early. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxdevtime.com. All right, we've established that you all love Linux for development, but why your particular distro and desktop? So, Kevin, you are a Fedora man. Why not Ubuntu or Debian or Arch or any of the others? Why Fedora?
That's a great question. I don't know what the origin is. It's probably that I like up-to-date packages. So you might say, why not Arch? Fedora has the up-to-date packages, kind of like Arch, not quite as bleeding edge. But then it also has a lot of the underpinnings that I've used in the enterprise setting. So a lot of the enterprises I've worked for have all been either RHEL or CentOS based. So using Fedora was kind of a natural fit. It forced me to learn things like SE Linux. And usually if you learn something on Fedora, then translating it over to a RHEL system is effectively a non-issue. So that's part of it. I think Fedora has also just had a kind of developer resurgence, maybe. There's a lot of developers that I've seen on Fedora, and I don't know if that's because of recent packages or not, but it seems like there's been a bit of a resurgence there. And I love the tooling and the community around it. It seems to be where people are trying out new things. And it's been a fun place to experiment. It's something I've really enjoyed.
I know that the Fedora people wouldn't like me saying this, but it has always felt like a power user distro, whereas Ubuntu used to be Linux for human beings. It was very, very noob friendly. And I know the Fedora people would say Fedora is noob friendly as well, but to me, it's not. To me, it is for power users. So it would kind of be a logical step that it's great for developers then.
I would very much agree with that. There is a few steps, and some of them are, I think, like ideologically driven in Fedora, like proprietary drivers and things of that nature, which a lot of that actually has been smoothed out over recent years. But it definitely is not quite as just install and go as something like your standard Ubuntu or other distro is. But I haven't found that those things are detriments. Like most of them are like a DNF install away. You just have to know which package, I guess.
Well, you just have to look at the installer, which I don't like because it's too complicated. But the reason that it's so complicated is because it's very powerful. You can do stuff with that installer that you simply can't do with the Ubuntu installer, for example.
I don't want to say anything bad about Anaconda, but it is not my favorite installer, that's for sure. But it is very powerful, yes.
It's interesting that you would say that a power user distro would overlap with a developer distro. I mean, I can see that some of the time that would be the same audience of people. But for me, I don't feel like I am a power desktop environment user or Linux distro user. I'm looking for stability mostly. I think if I was hacking on the Linux desktop, then I'd probably want the latest versions of packages and things like that. And then Fedora might make a lot of sense to me, or something else that's on the bleeding edge. But when I'm hacking on like cross-platform stuff, I want my tooling for my work to be completely up to date, and then I want everything else to be just stable as possible.
Amleth, do you just use Arch because it's cool?
No.
Really?
I use it because it was a great learning experience to get it installed, following the wiki and seeing how many of the pieces fit together. Because it's more of a DIY distro, I can pick and choose which pieces I particularly like because I prefer the configuration language or something as arbitrary as that. It doesn't matter. I can make whatever choices I like and put it all together so it's completely my own. And another reason I use it and really like it is because of the AUR. There's every package I can ever need there. And if it's missing one, a package build is just a shell script. Most of mine are like 50 lines or less. They're super easy to write.
So I used to use Arch pretty heavily. And this is probably an irrational thought of mine, but I always felt like whenever I built an Arch-based system, I would come to the end of my build or, I'd be happy with my system. And yes, I knew how it all went together and that was great, but I always felt like I was lacking the overall design of the system. And when I use something like Fedora or even an Ubuntu, I'll be like, oh, there's a team of people that have thought about how all these components fit together rather than just Kevin hacking it together and making it work on a system for him. So I know it's an irrational thought, but that's kind of how I feel sometimes on an Arch-based system. It feels like I hacked it together, not like I actually knew exactly what I was doing as I hacked those parts together.
That's completely rational. It's not irrational at all. You're completely right. Like an Ubuntu or a Linux Mint or, pick your distro. They have been put together by a team of people, exactly as you say, whereas Arch is just like, here's a bunch of bits, make your own distro, have fun.
I've just finished building a home server and I find it incredibly stressful, like designing systems and figuring out what service I'm going to run for this or configuring things. So the idea of like doing Arch for fun, it just fills me with stress.
I love putting all the pieces together. That's part of why I love systems administration. That's what it is, putting the stuff together and making sure it all stays together and doesn't fall apart.
I think the first time that I felt this way was when I was trying to troubleshoot something on a Fedora system, and it was something with the way the user level systemd service units were set up. And I was like, I would never have thought to build this way, but it's genius. I love the way it's set up and I love that they picked certain options. And when I was thinking about back to my previous Arch build, I was like, there's no way I would have come to this. So I would have built something that I would have ultimately, I guess, not enjoyed quite as much.
I do feel that particularly when it comes to anything related to Wayland, because there's all these like portals and permissions and getting stuff to talk to each other. And it feels like the documentation for putting those pieces together on the more DIY environments, like with Sway or Hyperland or something like that, I've tried it and they haven't worked super well. I have never gotten screen sharing and stuff working on Wayland. So when I do have a system that's primarily Wayland, I also have GNOME or something like that installed when I need screen share.
I think always in the back of my mind, too, I'm wondering, like, computers are so unbelievably fast nowadays that just because something's working, it could have been just because it brute forced its way through the most inefficient way to get there. And yeah, it's working to my eye, but I always wonder, is that just because computers are so fast that I don't notice that this is like crazy inefficient or I configured this thing wrong? So again, irrational fear that I have in the back of my mind.
It's really great that Arch exists because it means that people like you, Emily, like gain knowledge about how Linux works and then they can use that in future to make things better. I'm just glad that I don't have to fight my way through it.
Well, that's how I feel about Fedora. I'm glad there's people testing out all the new stuff like
Yeah, me too.
Pipewire and whatnot so that I don't have to.
But DNF is just so good.
What? How is it good?
I don't know if it's the way that they output things or the way that they do their atomic checking for upgrades. I just really like the output. I like the way that it's put together. I like the way the options are put together. I like the process for upgrading and holding things back, or I don't know. It just jives with the way my brain works, I guess.
It's funny when it comes to package management, apt, DNF, or Pacman, it's just fine by me. I mean, Pacman is a bit odd with the flags, like just random S's and Y's and stuff. But once you learn them, I could easily just use any of them and be happy, I think. But I will note that I kind of asked you this question about developing on these distros, and you've not really talked about the development. You've just talked about the sort of quality of life. And is that the crux of it, that you could ultimately use any Linux distro, but the one that you've picked just kind of suits your way of doing things? Like, Andy, we haven't got to you yet. You used to be an Ubuntu Mate man. Then you went to Debian with XFCE, but now I think you've given that up for Mate again.
Yeah, well, I've always been keen on Debian since when my first Linux distribution was like 20 floppy disks with Debian 202 something. I don't remember what number. And I tried to install it and I couldn't get it working. And so I moved on to Red Hat based ones. But then when Ubuntu came along, I was so happy because I could do this Debian based thing, but it was usable. And then Ubuntu started nagging me about how my system was deliberately insecure because I wasn't paying the money. So I moved to Debian very recently and it's been amazing. And I tried out XFCE because I read somewhere that Mate on Debian was terrible. And Joe told me XFCE was good, and XFCE was almost good enough. And then I got sick of a couple of little niggles, moved to Mate. It's perfect. It's exactly as good as it was on Ubuntu. I don't know what that person was talking about, saying it's no good on Debian. So once again, I'm completely comfortable.
Oh, I guess I didn't answer that part. So I do use Fedora, but I use the Plasma variant. I love KDE Plasma.
Ah, you like a lot of options, eh?
You don't have to use the options just because they're there.
But yeah, to answer your question, Joe, I'm confident that I could have the same Mate setup on pretty much any Linux distro you could name, and it would feel just as good.
Why Debian then? Just because it's stable, doesn't change?
Because of its philosophy and its community and its stability and its longevity, right? Like it's stood the test of time.
I think actually thinking back to it now, one of the main reasons I haven't used the Ubuntu-based distros as much is I use a lot of Podman at work, which is another one of like the RHEL products. So while it's available and you can use it on Ubuntu, it just, there's little things that just don't quite jive.
So that is actually an example of where you probably actually genuinely get a better development experience on one rather than another, because those Red Hat style distros are just much more comfortable with Podman.
And to address the development part for why I choose Arch, all the tools I need are available in the AUR. That's, again, everything in the world is in the AUR. I have heard that Void might have more packages than the AUR. I don't know whether that's true, though.
I think Nix has like the most or something.
Or maybe that, I don't remember. One of those two.
But no one has got time for Nix. Come on. Again, don't at me, please.
Another reason I love Arch is because I haven't had to do a big upgrade or reinstall or anything like that in like 5 years. I've just chugged along through all the rolling releases.
Yeah, because your system's broken once a week, so it doesn't need to be a big breaker.
But when it is broken, I can usually figure it out and fix it in like 30 minutes, and then it's no big deal.
Yeah, just follow that Arch blog and find out exactly why it's broken this week.
Exactly.
something key rings.
Speaking of Nix, I actually think that The Nix system, which lets you build kind of independent worlds where you can have different dependencies and different setups, could be incredibly useful for developers. I've often thought how great it would be to be able to have like say a Python 2 environment, or I don't know if they even support that, but like something completely isolated from everything else that is like less kind of whole system-y than Docker. So I've often thought I should learn about Nix and how I think it would have real benefits for development, but I haven't actually. Whenever I've looked at it, it's been too intimidating and I've run away again.
At work, we use GNU's Geeks tool very extensively to have a Nix-alike thing.
Geeks is on my list of things I should learn because it's the configuration language is Scheme Lisp as well, so It's got to be cool.
You could write Snake in it.
Yeah.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Do let us know why you develop on Linux, or maybe you don't. Maybe you prefer Windows or macOS. You can email us show@linuxdevtime.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Omeleth.
I've been Kevin.
And I'm a big fan of Dalton.
See you later.